The small town of Cedar Falls, Pennsylvania, had always prided itself on its quiet normalcy. Main Street stretched for barely 6 blocks, lined with family-owned shops that had served 3 generations of the same customers. The town hall, a modest brick building constructed in 1952, housed everything from marriage licenses to parking violations. And in the basement, surrounded by towers of forgotten municipal records and decades-old meeting minutes, worked a man who seemed to embody the town's unassuming character. Thomas Mitchell had been the town's archivist and librarian for 8 years, though most residents couldn't recall exactly when he'd started. He arrived each morning at 7:30 sharp, descended the creaking wooden stairs to his basement office, and spent his days organizing files that few people ever requested. His grey hair was always neatly combed, his flannel shirts pressed, and his wire-rimmed glasses perpetually perched on the bridge of his nose. The only sounds that emerged from the basement were the occasional thud of heavy record boxes and the steady hum of the ancient filing system that Thomas had somehow coaxed back to life. But everything changed on a Tuesday in October, when Sarah Chen, the town's new building inspector, needed access to construction permits from 1987. Sarah had moved to Cedar Falls from Philadelphia 3 months earlier, seeking the peace that only small-town life could offer after a messy divorce and a stressful career in urban planning. She was naturally observant, a trait that had served her well in her previous job, and as she descended into the basement archives, she immediately noticed how meticulously organized everything was. The dust seemed to have been strategically managed. Thomas looked up from his desk as she approached, and for just a moment, Sarah caught something in his eyes, a sharpness that seemed inconsistent with his mild-mannered appearance. Unlike the chaotic municipal basements she'd encountered in larger cities, this space felt almost military in its precision. Every box was labeled with the same neat handwriting, every shelf aligned to exact specifications, and even he directed her to the correct filing cabinet with quiet efficiency. But as he reached across his desk to hand her the key, Sarah's attention was caught by something that made her breath catch in her throat. On the ring finger of his right hand was a ring unlike anything she'd ever seen. Thick, black metal with an intricate design that seemed to shift in the fluorescent lighting. And at its center, a symbol that looked distinctly military, but unlike any branch insignia she recognized from her brother's Navy service. The ring seemed to pulse with an energy that contradicted everything about Thomas's carefully cultivated image of small-town normalcy. Sarah found herself staring, and when Thomas noticed her gaze, he quickly withdrew his hand and busied himself with paperwork. But the damage was done. Sarah had seen something that was clearly not meant to be seen, and the way Thomas's entire demeanor had shifted suggested that this ring was far more significant than a simple military memento. She completed her research quickly, thanking Thomas with forced casualness, but as she climbed the basement stairs, her mind raced with questions. The symbol on the ring had been etched with precision that spoke of official significance, not the kind of decoration you'd find at a military surplus store. More troubling was the way Thomas had reacted, not with the pride that most veterans showed when their service was acknowledged, but with something that looked distinctly like fear. That evening, Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on anything other than that ring and the man who wore it. She'd grown up in a military family and knew the difference between standard-issue insignia and something more specialized, more secretive. Her brother had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had told her stories about special operations units that operated in shadows so deep that even their existence was classified. Could a man like Thomas Mitchell, who seemed to have spent his entire adult life filing municipal documents, really have connections to that world? Sarah's curiosity proved stronger than her better judgment, and she began what she told herself was casual research into Thomas's background. Cedar Falls was small enough that most longtime residents knew each other's histories, but when Sarah asked around, she discovered something strange Nobody seemed to know where Thomas had come from before taking the job at the town hall. The previous librarian, Mrs. Henderson, had retired suddenly due to health issues, and Thomas had appeared almost immediately afterward with impeccable references and a quiet competence that had impressed the town council. But the references, when Sarah discreetly checked, were from organizations that seemed to exist only on paper, consulting firms with post office box addresses and phone numbers that went to generic voicemail systems. His rental application for the small apartment above the hardware store had been approved based on a substantial cash deposit and references that the landlord admitted he'd never actually verified. Even more intriguing was the fact that Thomas seemed to have no digital footprint prior to 8 years ago. No social media accounts, no online mentions, nothing that would suggest he'd lived a normal civilian life before arriving in Cedar Falls. It was as if Thomas Mitchell had simply materialized in the town, fully formed, complete with a perfectly crafted backstory that dissolved under the slightest scrutiny. Sarah knew she was venturing into territory that could be dangerous, but the mystery had taken hold of her analytical mind like a puzzle that demanded solving. The breakthrough came when Sarah decided to approach the mystery from a different angle. Instead of trying to trace Thomas's past directly, she began researching the symbol she'd seen on his ring. Hours of internet searches through military databases and historical archives yielded nothing but a chance conversation with her brother Marcus, who was now working as a defense contractor, opened an unexpected door. When Sarah described the symbol, a complex geometric pattern surrounding what appeared to be a stylized eagle with wings that seemed to blend into abstract lines, Marcus went silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice she'd never heard him use before, he told her to forget what she'd seen and never mention it to anyone else. But Sarah pressed him, and finally, Marcus revealed that he'd seen similar symbols during his time working with special operations units, symbols that belonged to programs so classified that their very existence was denied by official channels. These weren't the kind of operations that appeared in history books or congressional hearings. They were the shadow missions that powerful people in Washington preferred to pretend had never happened. Marcus warned her that if Thomas Mitchell was connected to those programs, then approaching him directly could be extremely dangerous, not just for her, but for him as well. People connected to those operations, Marcus explained, had ways of disappearing that left no trace and no questions that couldn't be conveniently explained away. Despite her brother's warnings, Sarah found herself paying closer attention to Thomas during her subsequent visits to the town hall. She began to notice details that she'd previously overlooked. The way he moved with a precision that suggested extensive physical training, how his eyes constantly scanned the room even during casual conversations, and most tellingly, how he seemed to possess an almost supernatural awareness of his surroundings. On one occasion, when Sarah was quietly descending the basement stairs, Thomas had called out her name before she'd made any sound that should have announced her presence. Another time, she'd watched him reorganize a section of files and noticed that his movements followed patterns that seemed more tactical than clerical, creating sightlines to the stairwell, positioning himself so that he could reach the exit quickly, and arranging the furniture in ways that provided cover rather than convenience. These weren't the habits of a small-town librarian. They were the ingrained behaviors of someone who had been trained to expect danger and respond to it with lethal efficiency. Sarah realized that Thomas Mitchell, whatever his real name might be, was probably one of the most dangerous men she'd ever encountered, and he was hiding in plain sight in the basement of her town's municipal building. The question that kept her awake at night was simple but terrifying. If someone with his apparent background and training was working as a small-town archivist, what was he really doing there? And what would happen if his true identity was discovered? The answer to that question began to emerge when Sarah made a discovery that changed everything she thought she knew about the situation. While researching property records for an unrelated building inspection, she stumbled across something that made her blood run cold. The basement of the town hall had been extensively renovated in the year before Thomas's arrival, and the construction permits revealed modifications that had nothing to do with municipal record storage. Hidden behind the innocent language of climate control improvements and electrical upgrades were specifications for equipment that Sarah recognized from her brother's descriptions of tactical communication systems. The basement had been fitted with signal-blocking materials, redundant power systems, and what appeared to be a sophisticated satellite communication array disguised as routine municipal infrastructure. Thomas wasn't just hiding in Cedar Falls. He was running some kind of operation from the basement of the town hall, using the town's own resources to mask activities that were almost certainly illegal. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. She hadn't stumbled across a retired soldier trying to live quietly. She'd discovered an active covert operation that was using her town as cover for activities that could potentially threaten national security. And now that she knew, she was no longer an innocent bystander. She was either an asset to be managed or a threat to be eliminated. Sarah's hands shook as she photographed the construction documents, knowing that she was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. But she also knew that she couldn't simply pretend she hadn't seen what she'd seen. If Thomas was running illegal operations from the town hall, then the residents of Cedar Falls had a right to know that their tax-funded building was being used as cover for activities that could put them all in danger. That night, Sarah made copies of all the evidence she'd gathered and stored them in multiple locations, including a safety deposit box in the next town over. She also wrote a detailed letter explaining everything she'd discovered and left instructions for it to be delivered to federal authorities if anything happened to her. Then, despite every instinct screaming at her to run, she made the decision that would change her life forever. She decided to confront Thomas directly. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the town hall early, before the regular staff, and descended into the basement where Thomas was already at his desk, as if he'd been expecting her. When she walked into his office, he looked up from his paperwork and smiled, not the mild, friendly expression she'd grown accustomed to, but something sharp and knowing that confirmed her worst fears. Thomas Mitchell, whoever he really was, had known all along that she was investigating him, and now they were both going to discover what happened when his carefully constructed cover was threatened by an inconveniently curious building inspector who had seen too much and asked too many questions. "I was wondering when you'd work up the courage to come down here and ask me directly," Thomas said, his voice carrying an edge that she'd never heard before. "You're very thorough, Ms. Chen. I respect that, even if it's about to complicate both our lives considerably." Sarah felt her mouth go dry as she realized that her weeks of careful investigation had been anything but covert. Thomas had been watching her watch him, and now she was standing in a basement office with a man who possessed skills and connections that could make her disappear without a trace. But instead of the fear she expected to feel, Sarah found herself filled with a strange sense of resolution. She'd come too far to back down now, and something in Thomas's demeanor suggested that he might be more interested in talking than in silencing her permanently. "I know what you are," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The question is what you're really doing here, and whether the people of this town are in danger because of it." Thomas studied her for a long moment, his fingers unconsciously turning the black ring that had started this entire chain of events. Then, to her complete surprise, he began to laugh, not the pleasant chuckle of a small-town librarian, but the bitter sound of a man who had carried secrets for far too long and was finally confronting the possibility of laying them down. "My real name is Colonel Thomas Mitchell, though that rank was stripped from me, along with every other trace of my official existence about 9 years ago," he said, his transformation from mild-mannered archivist to military officer so complete that Sarah felt like she was looking at an entirely different person. And I spent 23 years serving my country in capacities that ranged from conventional special operations to activities so classified that they don't appear in any official records. The ring you noticed belongs to Task Force Blackwater, not the private military company, but a Pentagon Black Ops unit that officially never existed. Thomas leaned back in his chair, and Sarah could see decades of exhaustion and moral compromise etched in the lines around his eyes. We were the people who handled the missions that couldn't be acknowledged, couldn't be explained, and couldn't be connected to official US policy. We operated in countries where we weren't supposed to be, eliminated threats that couldn't be addressed through conventional channels, and carried out objectives that required complete deniability. The weight of his words settled over the basement office like a physical presence, and Sarah began to understand that she wasn't just talking to a former soldier. She was facing a man who had spent decades as a weapon wielded by people in Washington who preferred to keep their hands clean while others did the dirty work of protecting American interests around the world. The problem with units like Blackwater, Thomas continued, is that eventually someone in power decides that the people who know all the secrets have become a liability themselves. 9 years ago, my entire unit was officially disbanded, and all records of our existence were purged from Pentagon databases. We were told that we were being retired with full honors and that our service would be remembered, even if it could never be acknowledged publicly. But retirement in the world of black operations doesn't mean a pension and a gold watch. It means a new identity, a quiet life somewhere unremarkable, and the understanding that your old life never happened. Sarah realized that she was holding her breath as Thomas spoke, understanding that she was hearing secrets that could destroy careers and topple governments if they ever became public. Most of my team members accepted their new lives and disappeared into civilian anonymity. But I started noticing things that didn't add up. Former colleagues dying in accidents that were statistically improbable. Families of deceased operatives receiving visits from government officials who asked pointed questions about what their loved ones might have shared about their service. Thomas's voice grew harder, and Sarah could see the anger that he'd been carrying for years finally beginning to surface. I realized that Task Force Blackwater hadn't been disbanded. We'd been marked for elimination, and our alleged retirement was actually a systematic assassination program designed to ensure that the secrets we carried would die with us. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow, and she found herself gripping the edge of Thomas's desk to keep from staggering. You're saying that the US government is murdering its own soldiers to cover up illegal operations, she whispered, her voice barely audible in the basement office that had suddenly become the most dangerous place she could imagine being. Thomas nodded grimly, and Sarah could see that admitting this truth was costing him something fundamental. Not the government as a whole, a small group of powerful individuals in the Pentagon and CIA who have been running unauthorized operations for decades and who view former operatives as unacceptable security risks. They've been systematically eliminating anyone who could expose their activities, making each death look like an accident or natural causes. Thomas stood up from his desk and walked to a filing cabinet that Sarah now realized probably contained something far more significant than municipal records. I came to Cedar Falls because it was the perfect place to disappear. Small enough that strangers are noticed, but large enough that I wouldn't stand out, with municipal records that I could manipulate to create a perfect cover identity. But I didn't come here just to hide. I came here to gather evidence and build a case that could expose the people who betrayed everyone who served in Task Force Blackwater. As he spoke, Thomas opened the filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder that was clearly not related to town business, and Sarah realized that the quiet librarian had been conducting his own investigation into the conspiracy that was trying to kill him. For 8 years, I've been documenting every suspicious death of former Blackwater operatives, tracking the financial connections between the officials involved in our supposed disbandment, and building a network of contacts who can verify the information I've gathered. Thomas explained, as he opened the folder to reveal photographs, financial records, and documents that clearly weren't supposed to exist. The challenge has been staying alive long enough to complete the investigation and finding a way to make the information public without getting myself killed in the process. The people behind this conspiracy have resources that most people can't imagine. They can manipulate official records, coordinate with law enforcement agencies, and make people disappear in ways that leave no trace. But they made one crucial mistake when they decided to eliminate the Blackwater operatives. They underestimated how much we learned about their methods during our years of service, and they didn't anticipate that some of us might fight back. Sarah stared at the evidence spread across Thomas's desk, understanding that she was looking at proof of crimes that went to the highest levels of American government. The ring you noticed isn't just a memento. It's a signal to other surviving Blackwater operatives that I'm still alive and still gathering intelligence. 3 other members of my unit are still out there, and we've been coordinating our efforts to expose this conspiracy while staying one step ahead of the people who want us dead. The magnitude of what Thomas was telling her was almost impossible to process, but Sarah could see that every detail fit with the evidence she'd uncovered about his carefully constructed identity and the hidden modifications to the town hall basement. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper as the full implications of the situation began to sink in. "Because," Thomas replied, "you've already seen too much to be ignored, and the people hunting me will eventually realize that you've been investigating my background. Once they identify you as a potential security risk, you'll become a target, just like everyone else who knows about Blackwater's real history." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, and she realized that her curiosity about a mysterious ring had inadvertently drawn her into a conspiracy that could cost her life. "But there's another reason I'm sharing this with you," Thomas continued, his voice taking on a note of something that might have been hope. "You have skills and resources that could help me complete this investigation and finally expose the truth about what happened to Task Force Blackwater. Your background in urban planning means you understand how to navigate bureaucratic systems and find information that others might miss. And your position as a building inspector gives you legitimate access to records and facilities that could be crucial to gathering the final pieces of evidence I need." Sarah felt the weight of Thomas's proposal settling over her like a physical burden, understanding that he was asking her to risk everything she'd built in her new life to help him fight a battle against enemies who possessed virtually unlimited resources and no moral constraints about how they dealt with threats to their operations. The sound of footsteps on the basement stairs interrupted Thomas's explanation, and both of them froze as they realized that someone was coming down to the archives at a time when the town hall should have been empty, except for the 2 of them. Thomas's transformation was instantaneous. The mild-mannered librarian disappeared completely, replaced by someone who moved with the lethal grace of a predator who had spent decades surviving in hostile environments. He motioned for Sarah to move behind the filing cabinets while he positioned himself where he could observe the stairwell without being seen by whoever was descending. The footsteps were measured and deliberate, suggesting someone who was familiar with the building's layout and comfortable moving through it in darkness. As the figure reached the bottom of the stairs, Sarah caught a glimpse of a man in a dark suit who was clearly not a Cedar Falls resident. His posture, his clothing, and most tellingly, the way his hand rested near what was obviously a concealed weapon, all screamed federal agent or military contractor. Thomas had been found, and the confrontation that he'd been preparing for over 8 years was about to begin in the basement of a small-town municipal building where Sarah had thought she'd found safety and simplicity. The stranger moved through the basement with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going, and Sarah realized with growing horror that Thomas's carefully constructed hideout had been compromised by people who possessed resources and intelligence capabilities that made her amateur investigation look pathetically inadequate by comparison. "Colonel Thomas Mitchell," the stranger said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to having his words obeyed without question. "Or should I call you by your current alias? You've led us quite a chase, but I think we both know that this conversation has been inevitable since the moment you decided to reject your retirement package." Thomas stepped out from behind the filing cabinets, and Sarah could see that he'd somehow acquired a pistol that he held with the casual competence of someone who had used such weapons professionally for decades. "Agent Harrison, I presume," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "In Pentagon Special Activities Division, tasked with cleaning up loose ends from operations that officially never happened. I've been expecting you, though I admit I hoped I'd have more time to complete my work before you tracked me down." The two men faced each other across the basement office, and Sarah realized that she was witnessing a confrontation between representatives of the same government who were prepared to kill each other to protect or expose secrets that most Americans would never know existed. You know why I'm here," Harrison said, his weapon still holstered, but his stance suggesting he could draw and fire faster than most people could blink. "The Blackwater files need to stay buried, and the people who served in that unit need to accept that their sacrifice includes taking their secrets to the grave. You've caused considerable trouble with your investigation, but it's not too late to end this quietly and without unnecessary complications." "The only unnecessary complication," Thomas replied, "is that good soldiers are being murdered to protect the careers of politicians and bureaucrats who were never willing to take responsibility for the orders they gave. Every member of Task Force Blackwater volunteered to risk their lives for their country, but we never agreed to be sacrificed to cover up the crimes of people who sent us into situations that violated both international law and basic human decency." Sarah could hear decades of anger and betrayal in Thomas's voice, and she began to understand the moral weight that had driven him to spend 8 years building a case against his former commanders. "You have 30 seconds to surrender the files and accept termination of your investigation," Harrison said, his hand moving toward his weapon with deliberate slowness. "And after that, this situation becomes significantly more complicated for everyone involved, including the civilian who's currently hiding behind the filing cabinets." Sarah's blood turned to ice as she realized that Harrison not only knew she was there, but had probably been watching her investigation of Thomas for weeks or months, gathering intelligence about how much she knew and whether she represented a security risk that needed to be managed. The basement that had seemed like a place of quiet municipal business had become a battlefield where the stakes were measured not in bureaucratic convenience, but in lives and the fundamental question of whether the American government was accountable to its own citizens. Thomas's response to Harrison's ultimatum was to smile, not with humor, but with the grim satisfaction of a man who had been preparing for this moment for years and was finally ready to see how his preparations would hold up against professional opposition. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Agent Harrison. You see, the Blackwater files aren't hidden here in Cedar Falls. They're distributed across multiple locations with instructions for automatic release if anything happens to me or the other surviving operatives. Kill me, and the entire conspiracy gets exposed within 24 hours. Let me live, and I continue gathering evidence until I have enough to bring down everyone involved in this cover-up, from the Pentagon officials who ordered our elimination to the contractors who carried out the assassinations." Harrison's professional composure cracked slightly, and Sarah could see that Thomas's revelation had fundamentally altered the tactical situation. "You're bluffing," Harrison said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that suggested he wasn't entirely confident in that assessment. "Am I?" Thomas replied. "Your intelligence on my activities has been impressive, but not perfect. You found me, but you didn't find the evidence, and you certainly didn't identify all the people who are helping me stay alive and continue this investigation. The dead man's switch isn't just a digital file, It's a network of former military personnel who understand exactly what's at stake and who have their own reasons for wanting justice for the people you've murdered. The standoff between Thomas and Harrison stretched into a tense silence that was broken by the sound of more footsteps on the basement stairs. Multiple people this time, moving with the coordinated precision of a tactical team. Sarah realized that Harrison hadn't come alone and that the basement was about to become a battleground between federal agents trying to preserve a conspiracy and a former special operations colonel who had spent years preparing to fight back against his former commanders. "Last chance, Mitchell," Harrison said, his weapon now drawn and aimed at Thomas's chest. "Eat, surrender the files, and accept termination, or we end this the hard way and deal with the consequences afterward." Thomas's response was to activate something on his desk that Sarah realized was probably a signal to whatever backup plan he'd prepared for this exact situation. "The hard way it is," Thomas replied, and Sarah understood that she was about to witness a confrontation that would determine not just whether Thomas survived, but whether the truth about Task Force Blackwater would ever see the light of day. The quiet librarian, who had spent 8 years filing municipal records, was about to become a soldier again, fighting a battle that would decide whether the most classified secrets of American foreign policy would remain buried with the people who carried them out, or whether justice would finally catch up with the officials who had betrayed their own operatives to protect their careers and reputations. The basement erupted into chaos as Thomas activated hidden defenses that transformed the municipal archive into a fortified position that could have been designed by military engineers. Emergency lighting bathed everything in red. Steel barriers dropped from the ceiling to block access points, and Sarah realized that the climate control improvements had included much more than sophisticated communication equipment. Thomas had spent years turning the basement into a stronghold that could withstand a professional assault, complete with escape routes, defensive positions, and countermeasures that would make Harrison's team pay dearly for every foot of ground they tried to take. But even as the battle began, Sarah understood that Thomas's real victory wasn't in the tactical situation he'd created. It was in the network of allies and evidence caches that would ensure his story survived, even if he didn't. The quiet librarian had outmaneuvered the conspiracy that thought it could silence him, and win or lose, the truth about Task Force Blackwater was finally going to be told. In the end, Thomas Mitchell had proven that even the most powerful cover-ups could be defeated by one determined soldier who refused to let his brothers in arms be forgotten, and who was willing to sacrifice everything to ensure that their service and their sacrifice would finally be acknowledged by the country they had died protecting.